The fire crackled pleasantly in the grate of the handsome sitting room at Whitehaven Mansions, casting dancing shadows upon the walls and lending a warm, amber glow to the December afternoon. Outside, London lay shrouded in a grey mist that pressed against the windows like a persistent caller. But within these comfortable apartments, Hercule Poirot sat ensconced in his favourite armchair, a cup of his preferred tisane steaming gently at his elbow. The little Belgian detective was engaged in that most satisfying of occupations, the arrangement of his Christmas cards upon the mantelpiece, each positioned with mathematical precision, their edges aligned to the millimetre. "There," he murmured to himself, stepping back to admire his handiwork with evident satisfaction. "That is what I call order. That is what I call method." His valet, George, entered bearing the afternoon post upon a silver salver, his countenance as impassive as ever, though Poirot fancied he detected a flicker of something, curiosity perhaps, in those carefully neutral eyes. "The post, sir. There is one letter which arrived by special messenger." Poirot's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. He reached for the letter in question, a heavy, cream envelope of excellent quality, the address inscribed in a flowing, feminine hand. The seal bore an impression he did not immediately recognize: a raven perched upon a sprig of mistletoe. "Curious," Poirot observed, turning the envelope over in his small, neat hands. "Most curious indeed." He slit the envelope with a silver letter opener and withdrew the contents. A single sheet of matching paper, covered in the same elegant script. "Dear Monsieur Poirot, I write to you in some desperation, though I confess I hardly know how to explain the nature of my fears. You will think me foolish, perhaps, or worse, hysterical. But I have heard of your remarkable abilities, and I believe you may be the only person who can help me. I am to spend Christmas at Ravenmere Hall in Cumberland, the ancestral home of my late husband's family, the Donovans. It is tradition that the family gather there each year, and though my husband, Edmund, passed away 3 years ago, I remain bound to them through my daughter, Violet. There is something wrong at Ravenmere, Monsieur Poirot. I have felt it for some time. A gathering darkness, a sense of impending catastrophe. And now, I have received a letter warning me that death will visit the hall this Christmas. I enclose the letter for your examination. I beg you to come to Ravenmere. Whatever your fee, I shall pay it gladly. We expect guests to arrive on the 22nd of December. I pray you will be among them. Yours most sincerely, Helena Donovan." Poirot reached into the envelope once more and withdrew a second sheet, this one of cheaper paper, the words formed from letters cut from newspapers and magazines in the time-honoured fashion of the anonymous threatener. "The mistletoe curse will claim its due. One of you will die before the Christmas bells ring. The raven watches." "Eh bien," Poirot murmured, his green eyes glittering with sudden interest. "A curse, a raven, and mistletoe. The English, they do so love their Christmas traditions." He turned to George, who waited with characteristic patience. "George, I shall require my warmest clothing packed. We travel to Cumberland." The journey north was long and tedious, the train making its slow progress through a landscape that grew increasingly stark and beautiful as they left the comfortable counties of the south behind. By the time they reached Penrith, darkness had fallen, and a light snow had begun to drift down from skies the colour of pewter. A motor car awaited Poirot at the station, an aged but serviceable Daimler, driven by a taciturn local man who introduced himself merely as Briggs, and thereafter confined his communications to grunts of varying inflection. The road to Ravenmere wound through wild country, past frozen tarns that gleamed like hammered silver in the moonlight, and over hills where the wind moaned through stands of skeletal trees. Poirot, who preferred the civilized comforts of city life, observed the desolate landscape with a mixture of appreciation for its savage beauty and profound relief that he had thought to bring his thickest overcoat. "Ravenmere Hall, sir," Briggs announced at last, and Poirot leaned forward to peer through the frost-rimed window. The house rose before them like a monument to past glories and present decay. Built of dark stone that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the moonlight, it sprawled across the hillside in a confusion of towers, gables, and mullioned windows, some of which glowed with warm light, while others stared blindly into the night like the eyes of the dead. A great raven weathervane surmounted the tallest tower, its wings spread as if about to take flight.
"Mon Dieu,"
Poirot breathed.
"it is like something from one of your English Gothic novels."
The front door opened as the motorcar crunched to a halt on the gravel drive, and a tall, distinguished figure emerged, silhouetted against the warm glow of the entrance hall. As Poirot alighted from the vehicle, he found himself being scrutinized by a pair of sharp grey eyes set in a face that bore the unmistakable stamp of aristocratic breeding. High cheekbones, aquiline nose, thin lips compressed into a line that might have indicated either displeasure or habitual reserve.
"Monsieur Poirot."
The voice was cool, measured. "I am Lord Alistair Donovan. My sister-in-law informed me she had invited you. I confess I am not entirely certain why."
"You do not believe in curses, Lord Donovan?"
"I believe in facts, Monsieur Poirot. In evidence. In the rational order of the universe." Lord Donovan stepped aside to allow Poirot to enter. "But Helena has been troubled of late. If your presence reassures her, then I suppose I must be grateful." The entrance hall was vast and cold, despite the fire that blazed in.
An enormous stone fireplace. Ancient tapestries depicting hunting scenes adorned the walls, and a grand staircase swept upward into shadow.
Above the fireplace hung a portrait of a stern-faced gentleman in 18th century dress, his hand resting upon the head of a great black raven.
"Your ancestor?"
Poirot inquired, indicating the portrait. "Cornelius Donovan, the 4th Baron. He built this house." Lord Donovan's expression flickered. Was it distaste? Fear? He also established the Christmas tradition of the Mistletoe gathering, and, according to family legend, he pronounced the curse.
"Ah, yes, the curse. I should very much like to hear the details of this curse."
Before Lord Donovan could respond, a woman appeared at the top of the staircase. Helena Donovan, Poirot surmised, recognizing something of the handwriting in the delicate grace of her movements. She descended swiftly, her pale silk gown whispering against the ancient stone, her face alight with mingled relief and anxiety.
"Monsieur Poirot, you came. I was so afraid you would think me foolish and refuse."
She was perhaps 40, with the remnants of considerable beauty still visible in her fine features and lustrous dark hair, though her eyes bore the shadows of grief, and her hands, as she extended them to Poirot, trembled slightly.
"Madame,
When a lady writes to Hercule Poirot in such distress, he does not refuse. He comes.
He took her hands gently.
Now, perhaps you will introduce me to the other guests and tell me more of this curse that troubles you so deeply.
The drawing room to which Helena conducted him was rather more cheerful than the entrance hall, with fires burning in twin fireplaces and an abundance of Christmas greenery adorning every surface. Swags of holly and ivy hung from the picture rails, and great bunches of mistletoe had been suspended from the chandeliers and doorways, their white berries gleaming in the lamplight.
The mistletoe,
Helena explained, noting Poirot's interest,
is central to the family tradition. On Christmas Eve, at midnight, all family members must gather beneath the oldest mistletoe, the one in the Great Hall, and drink a toast to the house. It has been done every year since Cornelius Donovan's time, and according to the legend, if any family member fails to participate, or if the ritual is interrupted,
she shivered.
Death will follow. And this curse has manifested itself before? 3 times, they say. In 1847, when Edgar Donovan refused to join the gathering, he was found dead in his bed on Christmas morning. In 1902, when a storm prevented the ceremony, 2 servants died in a fire that same night. And in 1923...
Helena, really? Lord Donovan had entered behind them, his voice sharp with irritation. Must you fill Monsieur Poirot's head with these old wives' tales?
They are not tales, Alistair. You know as well as I do what happened in 1923.
A muscle twitched in Lord Donovan's jaw. What happened in 1923 was a tragic accident. Nothing more. Your brother died, Alistair, my husband's father, on Christmas Day. The silence that followed was broken by the entrance of other guests, and Poirot found himself observing with keen interest as the house party assembled. There was Lady Constance Donovan, Lord Alistair's wife, a handsome woman of 50, with iron grey hair and the bearing of one accustomed to command, and their son, the Honourable Geoffrey Donovan, a nervous young man of perhaps 25, with his father's features but none of his composure. There was Violet Donovan, Helena's daughter, a pretty girl of 20, with her mother's dark hair and an air of barely suppressed excitement that Poirot noted with interest. And beside her, holding her hand with proprietorial ease, stood a tall, fair-haired young man, introduced as Captain James Ashworth, late of the Coldstream Guards. Violet and James are engaged to be married, Helena explained, though her smile did not quite reach her eyes. The announcement was made last month. My congratulations, Poirot murmured, observing the young couple with attention. Captain Ashworth met his gaze with easy confidence, but Violet's eyes flickered away, and her cheeks flushed pink. 2 more figures completed the party. Dr. Marcus Webb, a portly gentleman of middle years who served as the family physician and appeared to be on terms of considerable intimacy with the household, and Miss Arabella Crane, a striking woman of indeterminate age, with hair the colour of autumn leaves and eyes that seemed to hold secrets of their own. Miss Crane is a writer, Geoffrey Donovan explained, his pale face flushing. She's researching a book about Cumberland folklore. I met her in the village last month and invited her to spend Christmas with us. A writer? Lady Constance's tone could have frozen the Mediterranean. How modern. Miss Crane smiled, apparently unperturbed. I find the old legends fascinating, Lady Constance. The mistletoe curse, for instance, such a wonderful example of folk belief persisting into the modern age. It is not merely a belief, Helena said quietly.
It is quite real, and someone in this house knows it.
Dinner that evening was an uncomfortable affair. The party gathered in the vast dining room, where a table that could have seated 30 was laid for 9, and the shadows seemed to press in from the panelled walls despite the blazing candelabra. The conversation limped along, interrupted by awkward silences and abrupt changes of subject, and Poirot observed each face with the patient attention of a scientist studying specimens. Lord Donovan presided at the head of the table, carving the roast with mechanical precision, his face betraying nothing of his thoughts. Lady Constance sat opposite, her back rigid, her comments confined to observations about the weather and the quality of the wine. Between them, their son Geoffrey picked at his food and cast frequent glances toward Miss Crane, who ate with evident appetite and appeared entirely at ease. Helena sat at Poirot's right hand, her plate virtually untouched, her eyes moving constantly from face to face, as if seeking there some answer to a question she dared not ask aloud. Beside her, Violet and Captain Ashworth murmured together, their voices too low for Poirot to catch, though he noted that the young captain's hand frequently found its way to his fiancée's beneath the table. And at the far end, Dr. Webb consumed his dinner with the methodical efficiency of one accustomed to eating quickly between patients, while keeping up a running commentary on the excellence of the cook and the beauty of the decorations. It was during the fish course that the first incident occurred. The lights flickered, once, twice, and then went out entirely, plunging the room into darkness broken only by the guttering candles. Several people cried out. Something crashed, a glass, perhaps, or a plate. And in that moment of chaos, Poirot heard a sound that made his blood run cold. A low, harsh croaking, unmistakably the cry of a raven, emanating from somewhere within the room itself. The lights returned as suddenly as they had departed, and Poirot's sharp eyes swept the table. Every face wore an expression of shock or fear. Every face except one. Miss Arabella Crane was smiling. "How delightfully dramatic," she observed. "One might almost think the Raven Ghost had come to join us." "The Raven Ghost?" Poirot's eyebrows rose. "Did no one tell you, Monsieur Poirot? Cornelius Donovan kept a raven as a pet, a great black beast called Morrigan, after the Celtic goddess of death. When Cornelius died, the raven vanished. But according to legend, it appears before each death in the family, as a warning." "That's quite enough, Miss Crane." Lord Donovan's voice was tight with controlled anger. "I will not have ghost stories told at my table." "But surely, Lord Donovan, as a man who believes in facts and evidence, you must be curious about that sound we all heard. A raven calling from within this very room. How do you explain it?" Lord Donovan's face had gone pale. "I don't explain it. It was a trick of the storm, the wind in the chimneys." But Poirot had already risen from his seat and was examining the room with careful attention. The windows were sealed tight against the winter night. The fireplace was guarded by a sturdy screen. And yet... "Monsieur Poirot?" Helena's voice was tremulous. "What is it?" Poirot had stopped before a large sideboard that stood against the wall, its surface crowded with silver serving pieces. Behind the silver, barely visible, was a small black feather. "It would seem, madame," he said slowly, "that either ravens can walk through walls, or someone in this house wished very much to frighten us tonight." Later, in the privacy of the guest room allotted to him, a comfortable enough chamber, if one discounted the icy draughts that whistled through gaps in the ancient casements, Poirot sat before the fire and allowed his mind to work. The assembled party presented, he reflected, a fascinating study in tensions and contradictions. Lord Donovan, with his aggressive rationalism that seemed designed to conceal rather than express his true feelings. Lady Constance, watching everyone with cold evaluation, her aristocratic composure never slipping. Young Geoffrey, so clearly infatuated with Miss Crane, so clearly unsuited to his position as heir. And Helena, the outsider who had married into this family and remained bound to it even after her husband's death, clearly terrified of something. But what? The curse? Or something more immediate, more human? Then there were the others. Captain Ashworth, charming and confident, but was there something too practiced in his charm, too easy in his confidence? Violet, his fiancée, who seemed at once excited and afraid, of her engagement perhaps, or of something else entirely. Dr. Webb, the family physician, who had known these people for decades and must know their secrets. And Miss Crane, the mysterious writer, whose presence here seemed increasingly suspicious. A knock at the door interrupted his reverie. He opened it to find Helena, wrapped in a silk dressing gown, her face pale and strained. "Monsieur Poirot, forgive me for disturbing you, but I must speak with you privately." He ushered her to a chair by the fire and waited while she collected herself. "I have not told you everything," she began. "There is more to this curse than family legend. You see, Monsieur Poirot, I believe I know who sent that threatening letter. I believe it was someone in this house. Someone who means to commit murder and blame it on the supernatural." "And who do you suspect, madame?" Helena's hands twisted in her lap. "I cannot say for certain, but there is something you must know about the Donovan family. 3 years ago, when my husband Edmund died, he left everything to our daughter Violet, the estate, the investments, everything. Lord Alistair was furious. He believed, as the elder brother, that he should have inherited. And now, with Violet engaged to Captain Ashworth, the fortune passes out of the family entirely." "Exactly. Unless—" She could not finish. "Unless something were to happen to Mademoiselle Violet before the wedding." Helena nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You must protect her, Monsieur Poirot. I am begging you." Poirot patted her hand gently. "I have observed much this evening, madame, and I promise you this. Hercule Poirot will permit no harm to come to anyone in this house. The person who plays with curses and ravens will find that they have underestimated the little Belgian." The night passed uneasily, the wind howling around the ancient house like a living thing, and when dawn finally broke, it revealed a landscape transformed. Snow had fallen throughout the night, great drifts of it piling against walls and hedges, blanketing the moors in white, making the roads utterly impassable. Poirot descended to breakfast to find the household in some disarray. Lord Donovan was conferring urgently with Briggs about the state of the roads. Lady Constance was issuing orders to the servants with military precision, and the younger members of the party were gathered at the windows, exclaiming over the transformed scenery. "We're quite cut off," Geoffrey announced with evident satisfaction. "Briggs says the drifts are 6 feet deep in places. No one can get in or out." "How inconvenient," Miss Crane observed, her amber eyes glittering. "Or how convenient, depending on one's perspective." "What do you mean by that?" Lord Donovan demanded. "Only that if one were planning a murder and wished to ensure no interference from the outside world, one could hardly have arranged matters better." The silence that followed this remark was broken by a scream from somewhere above. A terrible sound, high and piercing, that echoed through the house and seemed to go on forever. They found Helena on the landing outside Violet's room, her face white as the snow outside, her hand pressed to her mouth. The door to Violet's chamber stood open, and from within came the sound of broken sobbing. Poirot pushed past the frozen onlookers and entered the room. Violet sat on her bed, her nightgown clutched around her, her face streaked with tears. Before her, on the pillow where her head had lain, was another message composed of cut-out letters, and beside it, coiled like a sleeping serpent, lay a sprig of mistletoe, dipped in what appeared to be blood. Kiss of death comes for the bride. The raven demands his due. When did you discover this, mademoiselle? Poirot's voice was calm, his manner reassuring, but his eyes missed nothing. Not the trembling of Violet's hands, not the way her gaze flickered toward the door where Captain Ashworth now stood, not the small red mark on her neck that might have been a scratch, or might have been something else entirely. Just now, she whispered. I woke, and it was there. How did it get there, Monsieur Poirot? How? That, Poirot said grimly, is precisely what I intend to discover. He examined the room with meticulous care. The windows were latched from the inside. The door had been locked. There was no second entrance, no hidden passage, at least none that was immediately apparent. And yet, someone had entered this room while Violet slept and left their macabre gift. The lock, Poirot observed, crouching to examine the door. It has been recently oiled. See how smoothly it turns, how silently. And this, he indicated a tiny scratch on the brass plate. Made by a pick, unless I am very much mistaken. You mean someone picked the lock? Captain Ashworth's voice was sharp. But who? And why? The why, Captain, seems clear enough. Someone wishes to frighten Mademoiselle Violet, or perhaps to make us believe they wish to frighten her. Poirot straightened. As to the who, that remains to be seen. The day that followed was tense and uncomfortable. The house party remained confined to their quarters, the snow still falling steadily outside. And everywhere Poirot went, he encountered knots of whispering servants or guests shooting suspicious glances at one another. Breakfast was a grim affair, taken in near silence in the cavernous dining room. The servants moved like ghosts, their faces pale and watchful. Lady Constance presided over the coffee service with mechanical efficiency, her back ramrod straight, her expression betraying nothing of whatever thoughts might lurk behind those cold grey eyes. Lord Donovan had excused himself with talk of estate business, though Poirot suspected he was simply unable to bear the atmosphere of barely suppressed hysteria. "More toast, Monsieur Poirot?" Lady Constance inquired, her voice perfectly modulated. "Thank you, no. The eggs, they were excellent." Poirot dabbed at his moustache with his napkin, his eyes never ceasing their methodical survey of the company. "Tell me, Lady Constance, the mistletoe ceremony, it has been performed every year without exception?" "Every year since 1752, when Cornelius Donovan built this house. It is a sacred family tradition." Her lips thinned. "Though I confess I have sometimes wondered whether tradition is merely another word for superstition." "You do not believe in the curse, then?" "I believe in what I can see and touch, Monsieur Poirot, not in legends and ghost stories." She set down her coffee cup with a precise click. "My husband shares this view. We are modern people, despite living in an ancient house." Yet there was something in her eyes,
a flicker of doubt, perhaps, or fear, that suggested her rationalism was not quite as complete as she would have him believe. Poirot filed this observation away for later consideration. After breakfast, he embarked upon a systematic exploration of the house. The butler, a dignified man named Harrington, who had served the family for 30 years, proved an invaluable guide. The West Wing, sir, contains the family apartments, Lord and Lady Donovan's suite, Mr. Geoffrey's rooms, and the late master's study, which has been kept exactly as it was. Harrington's face betrayed a flicker of emotion at this mention of Edmund Donovan. The East Wing houses the guest chambers, where yourself and the other visitors are accommodated. And the servants' quarters? Below stairs, sir, and in the attic rooms. There are 17 of us in total, quite a reduction from the old days, I'm told, when the household numbered over 50. You knew the late Mr. Edmund well, I take it? Harrington's composure wavered slightly. He was a good master, sir, kind to the staff, not like... He stopped himself. Not like? I speak out of turn, sir. Forgive me. But Poirot had noted the direction of Harrington's quickly suppressed glance, toward the study where Lord Alistair had closeted himself. The servants, it seemed, had their own opinions about the current master of Ravenmere Hall. He used the time productively, conducting his investigations with characteristic thoroughness. He examined the great hall where the Mistletoe ceremony was to take place, a vast medieval chamber with a vaulted ceiling and a great stone fireplace, above which hung the infamous mistletoe, dried and ancient, suspended from a chain of tarnished silver. He questioned the servants, learning that several of them had heard strange sounds in the night. Footsteps where no one should be walking. Doors opening and closing in empty corridors. The parlour maid, a nervous young woman named Sarah, proved particularly forthcoming.
It's the ghost, sir. I'm certain of it,
she whispered, her eyes darting to the shadows.
Morrigan, the old master's raven. They say it comes back before someone dies. My grandmother used to tell me stories. She worked here when she was a girl, and she saw it with her own eyes. The night before the old Baron died, in 1923, she saw a great black bird sitting on the windowsill of his room, just staring in. The next morning, he was dead.
And have you seen this bird yourself, Sarah?
Not the bird, sir, no. But I've heard things. Wings beating in empty rooms. That horrible croaking sound, like the one at dinner. And once...
She lowered her voice still further.
Once I saw something move in the corridor outside Miss Violet's room. A shadow-like. There one moment, gone the next.
When was this?
2 nights ago, sir. The night before you arrived.
Poirot thanked her gravely and moved on, but his mind was working furiously. 2 nights ago. The same night, presumably, that the threatening letter had been placed in Violet's room. Whoever was behind these incidents had been active even before the house party assembled. This suggested either a servant with access to all areas, or someone who had arrived at Ravenmere earlier than they had admitted. The library yielded further discoveries. Poirot spent 2 hours examining the shelves, searching for anything that might illuminate the family history or the nature of the curse. He found a complete set of family records dating back to the 17th century, including births, deaths, marriages, and, most interestingly, a thin volume bound in black leather titled The Mistletoe Tradition, A History. The book, written by some Victorian Donovan with antiquarian interests, detailed every mistletoe ceremony since 1752, along with every supposed manifestation of the curse. Reading through the accounts, Poirot was struck by a curious pattern. In each case where death had followed the ceremony, there had been significant family conflict in the preceding months. Financial disputes, contested inheritances, accusations of impropriety or crime. The curse, it seemed, had a way of striking when it was most convenient for someone in the family. And he made certain observations about the guests themselves, observations that he filed away in those famous little grey cells for later consideration. It was Miss Crane who found the next piece of the puzzle. Poirot discovered her in the library that afternoon, surrounded by ancient ledgers and yellowed documents, her autumn hair tumbled about her shoulders, her eyes bright with excitement.
"Monsieur Poirot, I'm so glad you're here. Look what I found."
She thrust a leather-bound journal toward him.
"This is Cornelius Donovan's private diary. I found it hidden behind a false panel in this bookcase, and it tells the true story of the curse."
Poirot took the journal with reverent care. The writing was faded but legible, and as he read, his eyebrows rose higher and higher.
"Mon Dieu," he breathed. "This changes everything."
According to Cornelius Donovan's own account, the curse had never been a curse at all. At least, not in the supernatural sense. It had been a murder. On Christmas Eve, 1752, Cornelius had discovered that his younger brother Roderick was plotting to poison him and claim the estate. He had confronted Roderick in the great hall beneath the mistletoe, and in the struggle that followed, Roderick had fallen and broken his neck.
"The curse," Miss Crane explained eagerly, "was Cornelius's invention, a way to explain his brother's death and frighten future generations into obedience. Every supposed curse death since then has been either coincidence or murder disguised as supernatural vengeance." "You believe, then, that someone in this house is using the legend of the curse to cover their own criminal intentions?" "Don't you?" Poirot regarded her thoughtfully. "What I believe, Miss Crane, is that you are either a very clever woman or a very foolish one. You have come to this house, inserted yourself into this family, and now you present me with evidence that points to murder. The question I must ask myself is, why?" For the first time, Miss Crane's composure faltered. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do, Miss Crane. I think you came here with a purpose that goes beyond researching folklore. And I think that before this Christmas is over, I shall discover what that purpose is." He left her standing amid the scattered papers, her face pale, her eyes following him with an expression he could not quite read. Fear, perhaps, or something very like it. That evening, the party gathered in the drawing room for drinks before dinner, and Poirot took the opportunity to observe them all with renewed attention. The atmosphere was electric with tension. Every word seemed fraught with hidden meaning, every glance loaded with suspicion. Lord Donovan stood before the fireplace, a glass of whisky in his hand, his face set in hard lines. Lady Constance sat apart, embroidering with mechanical precision, her needle flashing in the lamplight. Geoffrey had stationed himself near Miss Crane and was attempting conversation, though she responded only in monosyllables, her eyes fixed on some middle distance. Helena and Violet sat together on a small sofa, mother and daughter, holding hands like survivors of a shipwreck. Captain Ashworth paced restlessly, his military bearing at odds with his obvious agitation. And Dr. Webb had ensconced himself in a corner with a medical journal, though Poirot noticed that his eyes rarely touched the page. It was Lord Donovan who broke the uneasy silence.
I think we must address the elephant in the room, he said heavily. These incidents, the threatening letters, the ravens, the intrusion into Violet's bedroom, they cannot be permitted to continue. I intend to discover who is responsible and ensure they face appropriate consequences. And how do you propose to do that, Alistair? Lady Constance's voice was sharp. We are trapped here, with no access to the police, no means of communicating with the outside world. What do you suggest? That we hold a trial in the drawing room? Perhaps Monsieur Poirot might be prevailed upon to assist, Dr. Webb suggested mildly. He has, I understand, some experience in these matters. All eyes turned to the little Belgian, who had been sitting quietly in his corner, his fingers steepled beneath his chin.
It is true, Poirot said slowly, that I have investigated many crimes. And it is also true that I have formed certain impressions about the situation here at Ravenmere Hall.
He paused, his green eyes moving from face to face.
But I would like to ask some questions before I proceed further.
By all means, Lord Donovan said stiffly. Ask whatever you wish. Poirot nodded.
Very well. I shall begin with you, Lord Donovan. Your brother, Edmund, Violet's father, died 3 years ago. How did he die?
A muscle jumped in Lord Donovan's jaw. He fell from the tower. It was ruled an accident.
An accident? And yet, was there not some question at the time? Some suggestion that he might have taken his own life, or that he might have been pushed?
There was gossip. There is always gossip. But the coroner's verdict was accidental death, and I see no reason to revisit it now.
And yet,
Poirot continued mildly,
the manner of his death has certain resonances. A fall, a curse, a family gathering at Christmas.
He turned to Helena.
Madame, you were here when your husband died, were you not?
Helena's face had gone very pale.
Yes, it was Christmas Eve, the night of the mistletoe ceremony. Edmund went up to the tower to check the weather. He was worried about guests arriving in the morning. When he didn't come down, I went to look for him. I found him.
She stopped, pressing a handkerchief to her lips.
Below the tower. Dead. Yes.
Poirot nodded sympathetically.
And since that time, you have felt that something was wrong. That the curse, as you call it, was awakening. I have felt watched, Helena whispered. I have heard sounds in the night. Footsteps, breathing. And the ravens. They circle the house constantly now. They never used to do that. Ravens are carrion birds,
Miss Crane interjected quietly.
They gather
where they sense death is near. Thank you, Miss Crane, for that cheerful observation. Captain Ashworth's voice was tight with controlled anger. If you're trying to frighten everyone, you're doing an admirable job. I'm merely stating facts, Captain. Is that not what Lord Donovan advocates? Facts over superstition?
What I advocate, Lord Donovan snapped, is common sense. These letters, these theatrical displays, they are clearly the work of someone with a twisted sense of humour, someone who enjoys frightening others for their own amusement.
Or someone with a very specific purpose,
Poirot said quietly.
Someone who wishes to create an atmosphere of fear and confusion before striking at their real target.
And who, Dr. Webb asked slowly, do you believe that target to be? Monsieur Poirot?
That, said Poirot, I am not yet prepared to say.
Dinner was cancelled by mutual consent. No one had appetite for it. Instead, trays were sent to rooms, and the party dispersed to their separate quarters, each nursing their suspicions and fears in private. Poirot did not retire. Instead, he sat in the library, the ancient journal open before him, his mind working through the tangled threads of the case. There were patterns here. Patterns of greed, of jealousy, of old wrongs seeking new vengeance. Edmund Donovan's death ruled accidental, but surrounded by doubt. The fortune that had passed to Violet, the fortune that Lord Alistair believed should have been his. The engagement to Captain Ashworth that would take that fortune out of the family forever. And then there was Miss Crane, the outsider who had inserted herself so smoothly into the household. What was her true purpose here? What did she know that she was not telling? He was still pondering these questions when the clock struck midnight, and from somewhere in the depths of the house, another scream shattered the silence of the winter night. By the time Poirot reached the great hall, a crowd had already gathered. Servants huddled in the doorways, their faces masks of terror. The family stood in a frozen tableau around the fireplace, their eyes fixed on the figure that lay crumpled beneath the ancient mistletoe. Lord Alistair Donovan was dead. He lay on his back, his eyes open and staring, his face contorted in an expression of horror and surprise. Around his throat, like a macabre necklace, was wound a sprig of mistletoe, and protruding from his chest, its silver blade gleaming in the firelight, was an antique letter opener in the shape of a raven.
Mon Dieu,
Poirot breathed, crossing himself.
The curse has claimed its victim.
It wasn't the curse, Lady Constance said, her voice eerily calm. Curses don't use letter openers. My husband was murdered. Her gaze swept the assembled company with cold assessment. And the murderer is standing in this room. Poirot took command of the scene with quiet authority. The body was not to be moved. The room was to be sealed. No one was to leave. The house, not that they could, with the snow still blocking every road. And each person present would account for their whereabouts during the hour preceding the discovery of the body.
I was in my room,
Helena said, her voice trembling.
Reading. I heard nothing until the scream.
Which of you screamed? Poirot asked. It had been one of the maids, a girl named Lucy, who had come to bank the fire and found the master lying dead beneath the mistletoe. She was currently prostrate in the servants' hall, being attended by Dr. Webb, and unlikely to be able to provide coherent testimony for some time. I was with Violet, Captain Ashworth said. In the morning room, we were talking. About what? About our wedding plans. The date, the arrangements, nothing of significance. And you, Mademoiselle Violet, you confirm this? Violet nodded, but Poirot noticed that she would not meet his eyes, and her hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. I was in the library, Geoffrey said. His face was grey with shock, but his voice was steady. Looking for a book. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear anything. And you, Miss Crane? The writer met his gaze evenly. I was in my room, writing. You have witnesses to this? I'm afraid not. I keep rather solitary habits when I'm working. Lady Constance had not yet spoken. She stood over her husband's body, looking down at him with an expression that Poirot found difficult to read. Grief? Relief? Calculation? Lady Constance, he said gently, where were you this evening? She looked up, her eyes dry, her composure intact. In my sitting room, alone. I was not feeling well and retired early. You heard nothing? No sounds of struggle? No cry for help? My sitting room is on the opposite side of the house. I heard nothing until Lucy screamed. Poirot nodded slowly. Every alibi was vague, unprovable, unsatisfactory. Any of them could have done it. Any of them could be lying. He knelt beside the body, his keen eyes examining every detail. The letter opener had been driven deep into the chest, through the heart, a killing blow that required either considerable strength or accurate anatomical knowledge. Dr. Webb, then? Or Captain Ashworth, with his military training? The mistletoe around the neck had been wound post-mortem, judging by the absence of bruising. A theatrical touch, designed to invoke the curse. Someone wanted this death to look like supernatural vengeance, but something was wrong. Something did not fit. Poirot examined the floor around the body, then the letter opener itself, then the victim's hands. And there it was, the detail that did not belong. Clutched in Lord Donovan's right hand, almost invisible in the shadows, was a small scrap of fabric. Poirot extracted it carefully and held it up to the light. Red silk, expensive, fresh. His mind raced through the evening's observations. Who had been wearing red? Not Helena, who favoured pale colours. Not Lady. Constance, who was dressed in severe black. Not Violet, who wore a dress of dove grey. Miss Crane. Miss Crane had been wearing a red silk blouse, but that seemed too easy, too obvious. The woman was a mystery, yes, but she hardly seemed stupid enough to leave such damning evidence at the scene of her crime. Unless she had been framed. Poirot rose and looked at the assembled company, his expression grave. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "there has been murder done here tonight. A cruel, calculated murder, dressed up in the trappings of your family curse. I intend to discover who committed this crime, and I shall begin by speaking with each of you privately. Until then, I must ask you all to remain in the house and to refrain from discussing the case among yourselves. Is that understood?" Nods and murmurs of assent. Only Miss Crane spoke aloud. "And if the murderer strikes again, Monsieur Poirot? What then?" Poirot met her gaze steadily. "Then, Miss Crane, I shall have failed in my duty. But I do not intend to fail." The interviews began at dawn, conducted in the library where Cornelius Donovan's portrait looked down upon the proceedings with apparent disapproval. Poirot had requested that the room remain undisturbed, and so his notes were spread across a table still littered with Miss Crane's research materials. Helena Donovan was the first to be summoned. She entered hesitantly, her face drawn with exhaustion and fear, and sank into the chair opposite Poirot with evident relief. "Monsieur Poirot, I must tell you something. Something I should have told you when you first arrived." She took a deep breath. "Lord Alistair was not the man he appeared to be. He was cruel, controlling. He had been putting pressure on Violet to break her engagement to Captain Ashworth, to marry someone of his choosing instead, someone who would keep the fortune in the family. And who did he have in mind?" Helena hesitated. "His son, Geoffrey." Poirot's eyebrows rose. "But Geoffrey is Violet's cousin. Such a marriage would be legal, and not uncommon among aristocratic families, particularly when money is involved."
Helena's voice was bitter.
Alistair didn't care about Violet's happiness. He only cared about the estate, the fortune, the Donovan legacy. Did Violet know of this plan? She knew. She refused, of course. But Alistair was not a man who accepted refusal easily. He had been making threats, subtle ones, but threats nonetheless. He hinted that he knew something about her father's death, something that could destroy her if it came to light. And what was this something?
Helena's eyes filled with tears.
I don't know, but I believe he was implying that Edmund's death was not an accident, that there was evidence pointing to someone in the family.
To you, perhaps? She recoiled as if struck.
How can you suggest such a thing? I loved Edmund. Forgive me, madame. I must ask these questions.
Poirot leaned forward, his voice gentle but relentless. Where were you on the night your husband died?
I told you, I was here, in the house. When Edmund didn't come down from the tower, I went to look for him. I found him dead.
And there was no one else on the tower? No sign of struggle?
Nothing, just Edmund lying in the snow, with his eyes open, like he was still looking for something.
Poirot made a note. Thank you, madame. You may go, but please, think carefully about whether there is anything else you have not told me. In a case of murder, the smallest detail may prove vital. Helena rose, her hands still trembling.
I want justice for Alistair, Monsieur Poirot. Whatever he was, he didn't deserve to die like that. No one does.
When she had gone, Poirot sat in silence for a long moment, reviewing what he had learned. Helena's revelation added a new dimension to the case. If Lord Donovan had been blackmailing Violet, threatening to expose some secret about her father's death, then Violet had a motive for murder. But so did Helena herself. And Captain Ashworth, if he knew about the threats to his engagement. And Miss Crane, if her mysterious agenda had brought her into conflict with the Lord of the Manor. The web of motives was growing more tangled by the hour. Captain Ashworth was the next to be interviewed. He strode into the library with military briskness, his handsome face set in determined lines. I know what you're thinking, Monsieur Poirot, he said without preamble. I had motive, I had opportunity, and I was trained to kill. But I didn't murder Lord Donovan. Then you will not object to answering my questions? Ask away. Poirot studied him thoughtfully. You say you were with Mademoiselle Violet in the morning room last night. For how long? Most of the evening, from about 9 o'clock until we heard the scream. And during that time, neither of you left the room? A slight hesitation. Violet stepped out briefly. To fetch a shawl, she was cold. How long was she gone? I don't know. 10 minutes? 15? I wasn't watching the clock. And you remained in the morning room the entire time? Another hesitation, longer this time. I stepped out as well, for a cigarette, perhaps 5 minutes after Violet left. Ah, Poirot's eyes gleamed. So, in fact, for a period of approximately 5 to 10 minutes, neither of you can account for the other's whereabouts. Captain Ashworth's jaw tightened. If you're suggesting that Violet... I am suggesting nothing, Captain. I am merely establishing facts. Poirot leaned back in his chair. Tell me about your relationship with Lord Donovan. Were you on friendly terms? We were civil, for Violet's sake.
The captain's voice hardened. But no, we were not friendly. He made it clear from the beginning that he disapproved of our engagement. He thought Violet should marry within the family, keep the money where it belonged, as he put it. Did he ever threaten you directly? Not in so many words, but he implied that he had ways of preventing the marriage, that if I persisted, I would regret it. And what did you make of these implications? Captain Ashworth's face was grim. I made nothing of them, Monsieur Poirot. I loved Violet, and I intended to marry her regardless of her uncle's objections. Nothing he said or did was going to change that. Not even murder? The captain's eyes flashed dangerously. I am a soldier, Monsieur Poirot. I have killed men in battle, enemies of my country. But I have never murdered anyone, and I never will. If you're looking for a killer, I suggest you look elsewhere. He rose without being dismissed and strode from the room, his back rigid with anger. Poirot watched him go, his expression thoughtful. The captain's alibi had crumbled under examination. Both he and Violet had been alone at crucial moments. But his anger seemed genuine, his protestations of innocence convincing. Of course, Poirot reflected, the most convincing liars were often those who believed their own lies. Miss Crane came next, and she was utterly composed, settling into the chair opposite Poirot with an air of polite interest, as if she were a guest at a dinner party rather than a suspect in a murder investigation. Before you ask, Monsieur Poirot, I did not kill Lord Donovan. I had no reason to. And yet, Poirot said mildly, you are not what you appear to be, Miss Crane. A writer researching folklore? I think not. For the first time, a flicker of something, surprise, respect, crossed her features. You are perceptive. Very well, I shall tell you the truth. She leaned forward, her voice low. My real name is Arabella Thornton. I am a private investigator. Poirot's eyebrows rose. Indeed. And who engaged your services? Edmund Donovan, 3 years ago, just before his death. Explain. Miss Crane, Miss Thornton, took a deep breath. Edmund came to me 6 weeks before that Christmas. He believed someone in his family was trying to kill him. He had received threatening letters similar to the ones Helena has been receiving. He wanted me to investigate, discreetly. And what did you discover? Not enough. I began my investigation, but before I could make any real progress, Edmund was dead. The official verdict was accident, but I never believed it. I've been waiting 3 years for a chance to return to this house and finish what I started. And Geoffrey Donovan's invitation provided that chance. She nodded. The poor boy is hopelessly infatuated with me. It was easy enough to manipulate him into inviting me for Christmas. I knew that if there was going to be another death, it would happen here, at the Mistletoe ceremony. You expected Lord Donovan to die? I expected someone to die, though I admit Lord Donovan was not at the top of my list of likely victims. She paused. Or perpetrators. You believed Lord Donovan capable of murder? I believed him capable of anything that served his interests. Edmund told me as much. He was terrified of his brother, convinced that Alistair would stop at nothing to claim the estate. Poirot considered this carefully. Miss Thornton's story answered many questions, but it raised others. If Edmund Donovan had feared his brother, and that brother had now been murdered— "The scrap of silk," he said suddenly, "the red silk found in Lord Donovan's hand. You were wearing a red blouse last night." "Yes, I noticed that particular detail myself." Her smile was grim. "Someone went to considerable trouble to implicate me, which suggests either that I am innocent or that I am extremely clever." "And which is it, Miss Thornton?" "I leave that for you to determine, Monsieur Poirot. You are, after all, the famous detective." The afternoon brought no further clarity. Poirot interviewed Lady Constance, whose composure never wavered; Geoffrey, whose grief was genuine but whose alibi was vague; and Dr. Webb, who had been in his room reading medical journals and could offer no useful information. But it was Violet who provided the crucial piece of the puzzle. She came to Poirot's room as darkness was falling, her face pale, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "Monsieur Poirot, I must tell you something. Something I've kept secret for 3 years." She took a shuddering breath. "On the night my father died, I saw someone on the tower. Someone pushing him." Poirot leaned forward intently. "Who, mademoiselle? Who did you see?" "I couldn't tell. It was dark, snowing. I saw only a figure, a dark shape against the sky. I heard my father cry out, and then he fell." Tears streamed down her face. "I've never told anyone. I was afraid that the killer would come for me next." "And you believe that killer was your uncle?" "I thought so. For 3 years I've believed it was him. That's why I agreed to the engagement with James. I wanted to escape this family, this house, before the killer could strike again. But now Alistair is dead, and I don't know what to think." "Unless," Poirot said slowly, "your uncle was not the killer. Unless he was murdered to prevent him from revealing what he knew." Violet stared at him with dawning horror. "You mean there were 2 of them? Working together?" "It is possible, or it is possible that the killer of your father and the killer of your uncle are 2 different people entirely, with 2 different motives." Poirot rose and began to pace. "Tell me, mademoiselle, has anyone else behaved strangely in recent months? Anyone who might have had reason to fear exposure?" Violet thought for a long moment. "Captain Ashworth," she said finally. "James, he's been different lately. Nervous, secretive. I assumed it was wedding jitters, but now I wonder." "You wonder if he knows more than he has told us?" "Yes." Her voice was barely a whisper. "And I wonder if I really know him at all." The house had grown very quiet. Outside, the snow continued to fall, sealing them all within this prison of stone and secrets. Somewhere, a clock chimed the hour. 8 o'clock, Christmas Eve. In 4 hours, the family would gather for the mistletoe ceremony. If the curse was to claim another victim, the time was growing short. Poirot gathered the household in the drawing room that evening, his manner grave. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "I must inform you that I have made considerable progress in my investigation. I now understand
the broad outlines of what has occurred in this house. Not only last night, but 3 years ago as well.
The assembled company stirred uneasily. Helena clutched her daughter's hand. Captain Ashworth stood rigid, his face unreadable. Miss Thornton watched with professional interest, while Lady Constance maintained her characteristic composure.
However,
Poirot continued,
there are still gaps in my knowledge, pieces of the puzzle that do not yet fit. I propose, therefore, to continue as planned with the mistletoe ceremony at midnight. During this ceremony, I believe the killer will be forced to reveal themselves.
"You're using us as bait," Geoffrey said, his voice shaking. "You're hoping the murderer will try again."
Not hoping, monsieur. Expecting. And I shall be watching.
Poirot's eyes swept the room.
The ceremony will proceed exactly as tradition dictates. All family members will gather in the great hall beneath the ancient mistletoe. The toast will be drunk, and justice will be done.
The hours crept by with agonizing slowness. The house seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Fires were banked, candles were lit. The servants whispered among themselves and crossed themselves when they thought no one was watching. At 11 o'clock, a fresh blizzard began, the wind screaming around the house like a chorus of the damned. The lights flickered ominously, but did not fail. At 11:30, the party began to assemble in the great hall. The room was vast and cold, despite the fire roaring in the medieval hearth. Shadows gathered in the corners, and the ancient mistletoe hung motionless above them, its silver chain gleaming in the candlelight. Someone had placed a circle of chairs beneath it, and a table bearing a crystal decanter of wine and a set of matching glasses. Helena took her place first, her face pale but determined. Violet and Captain Ashworth followed, sitting side by side, but not touching. Lady Constance entered, with Geoffrey at her side, her black dress making her look like a figure from a Victorian mourning portrait. Dr. Webb settled into a chair near the fire, his medical bag at his feet. "Just in case," he said. Miss Thornton stood apart, near the door, her eyes missing nothing. And Poirot? Poirot stood in the shadows, watching. The clock began to strike 12. At the first chime, Lady Constance rose and took the decanter in her hands. "As is tradition," she said, her voice clear and steady. "The eldest remaining Donovan will pour the wine." She filled each glass with methodical precision, handing them around the circle. When everyone held a glass, she raised her own. "To Ravenmere Hall, to the Donovan family, to those who have gone before, and those who remain." "To Ravenmere Hall," the others echoed, and as one they raised their glasses to their lips. "Stop!" Poirot's voice cut through the moment like a blade. Every eye turned to him. "Put down your glasses. The wine has been poisoned." Gasps. The clatter of crystal hitting the floor. Helena had gone white as snow. How do you know?" she stammered. "Because I know who killed Lord Alistair Donovan, and I know what they intended to happen tonight." Poirot stepped into the circle of light, his eyes burning with fierce intelligence. "The murderer planned to kill again. Not one victim this time, but several. A massacre to be blamed on the family curse." "But who?" Geoffrey demanded. "Tell us who!" Poirot's gaze moved slowly around the circle, resting on each face in turn. Then it came to rest on one figure, and his voice, when he spoke,
was filled with cold finality. The murderer is standing among you now. The murderer who killed Edmund Donovan 3 years ago and Lord Alistair Donovan last night. The murderer who has been playing a long and patient game, waiting for this moment to claim their final victory.
Enough of this theatre,
Lady Constance snapped.
Name the killer, Monsieur Poirot, if you know who it is.
Very well. Poirot drew himself up to his full height, magnificent in his certainty. The killer is Captain James Ashworth. The silence that followed was absolute. A silence so profound that one could hear the distant crackling of the fire, the soft whisper of snow against the windows, the ragged breathing of those assembled in the circle. Then several things happened at once. Violet screamed, a high, piercing sound of anguish and disbelief that seemed to echo from the ancient stone walls. Helena swayed as if about to faint, her hand flying to her throat, her face draining of colour. Geoffrey leapt to his feet, his chair clattering backward, his young face a mask of shock and confusion. Lady Constance remained motionless, but something flickered in those cold grey eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or the bitter satisfaction of suspicions confirmed. Dr. Webb half rose from his seat, his physician's instincts warring with his frozen astonishment. Miss Thornton's right hand moved with subtle, practiced ease toward the concealed weapon she carried. And Captain Ashworth laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. There was no humour in it, no warmth, no humanity. Only a cold, harsh amusement that seemed to belong to a creature wearing human form rather than a man. The laugh echoed in the vast hall, mingling with the distant howl of the wind, and those who heard it felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter night. How very melodramatic, Monsieur Poirot. How very theatrical. You should have been upon the stage. The captain's voice was silk over steel. And how very, very wrong. Am I? Poirot's voice was soft, but it carried the weight of absolute certainty. He moved forward into the full light of the fire and candles, his small figure somehow commanding the attention of every person in the room. His green eyes glittered with the fierce intelligence that had solved 100 mysteries, brought 100 criminals to justice. Then let me explain. Let me tell you a story. A story that began 3 years ago, but has its roots much further in the past. He began to pace, his hands clasped behind his back, his steps measured and deliberate. The movements of a man who knows he holds all the cards and is preparing to lay them upon the table one by one. 3 years ago, a young man came to this house for the first time. An ambitious young officer with expensive tastes and empty pockets. He wore the uniform of a British soldier. He spoke with the accent of the educated classes. He carried himself with the easy confidence of one born to privilege. He was, in short, exactly the kind of young man a wealthy family would welcome as a suitor for their daughter. Captain Ashworth's expression remained fixed in that cold smile, but Poirot noted the tension in his jaw, the whitening of his knuckles as his hands gripped the arms of his chair. This young man met Violet Donovan, a beautiful heiress, and he saw his opportunity. Marriage to her would bring him everything he had ever wanted: wealth, social position, the respectability he had pursued all his life. But there was an obstacle: her father, Edmund Donovan, who was not so easily deceived. Poirot paused, allowing the silence to build, watching the faces around the circle with the patience of a cat watching mice. Edmund Donovan was a careful man, a thorough man. When his daughter announced her interest in the handsome young captain,
Edmund did what any prudent father would do. He investigated. He hired agents. He made inquiries in London, in the captain's supposed hometown, in the regiments where the captain claimed to have served. And what he discovered horrified him. What truth? Violet's voice was barely a whisper, her face pale as moonlight, her eyes huge and dark in the flickering candlelight. The truth that Captain Ashworth is not who he claims to be. He is not the son of a respectable military family. He is not even Captain James Ashworth. Poirot's voice rang through the hall. He is Jonathan Briggs, the son of a servant who worked in this very house 30 years ago. A servant who was dismissed in disgrace after being caught stealing from the family silver. The son who swore revenge, who changed his name, invented a history, forged documents, and worked his way up through the ranks of society with nothing but charm, ruthlessness, and an absolute determination to claim what he believed was owed to him. Captain Ashworth, or rather Jonathan Briggs, had gone very still. The smile had frozen on his face, and beneath it, something else was emerging, something cold and reptilian, and utterly without mercy. "You have no proof of this," he said, but his voice had changed. The cultured tones were slipping, revealing rougher vowels beneath. "On the contrary, I have Edmund Donovan's complete dossier, which he gathered over 6 weeks of investigation. I have the birth certificate of Jonathan Briggs, born in Cumberland in 1895, to Thomas Briggs, footman, and Mary Briggs, née Ashworth, whose maiden name you borrowed for your new identity. I have statements from 3 witnesses who knew you as a boy, who remember you swearing vengeance on the family that ruined your father. And I have this." Poirot produced a folded document from his pocket. Edmund Donovan's final letter, found hidden in a secret compartment in his study, explaining everything. He wrote it the night before he died, as insurance against your violence. For he knew, you see, what you were capable of. He knew that you had killed before. "Killed before?" Helena's voice was sharp with horror. "Oh yes. Edmund Donovan discovered that before coming to Cumberland, the man who called himself Captain Ashworth had been involved in the deaths of 2 other wealthy young women, one in Sussex, one in Devon. Both deaths were ruled accidental. Both women had been engaged to charming young military men who vanished after the funerals, taking substantial sums of money with them." "That's a lie!" The captain was on his feet now, his composure finally shattered, his face twisted with rage. "You can't prove any of this." "I can. I have. And Edmund Donovan proved it 3 years ago. That is why you killed him, Captain. Or should I say, Mr. Briggs. Because he was going to expose you, destroy you, send you to the gallows where you belonged. So on Christmas Eve, on that snowy night, you followed him to the tower. You pushed him to his death. And you let everyone believe it was an accident. Or the curse." The captain's composure finally cracked completely. His face twisted with rage, and before anyone could move, he had drawn a revolver from his pocket and levelled it at Poirot. "Give me that letter." "James, no!" Violet cried. "Stay back, all of you." The captain's hand was steady, his eyes wild. "Give me the letter, Poirot, or I'll kill everyone in this room and blame it on the curse. It worked before. It will work again." "It will not work," Poirot said calmly. "Because I have taken precautions. The police are on their way. The roads have been cleared since this afternoon. And Miss Thornton,
who you perhaps did not realize is a private investigator, has been gathering evidence against you for 3 years. The captain's eyes darted to Miss Thornton, who had produced a small pistol of her own from somewhere in her clothing. "Lower the gun, Captain," she said quietly. "It's over." For a long moment, the outcome hung in the balance. Then, slowly, Captain Ashworth's shoulders slumped. The revolver dropped from his hand and clattered to the floor. "You're right," he said dully. "It is over. It's been over since the moment Edmund Donovan discovered my secret. I've been running ever since. Killing, scheming, trying to stay one step ahead. But I'm tired, Monsieur Poirot. So very tired." Dr. Webb moved forward and took the captain firmly by the arm. "I'll keep him secure until the police arrive." As the murderer was led away, Violet collapsed into her mother's arms, sobbing. Helena held her tightly, her own face wet with tears.
"How could I have been so blind?"
Violet whispered.
"I loved him. I trusted him."
"Do not blame yourself, mademoiselle," Poirot said gently. "The captain was a consummate performer. He deceived everyone, even those closest to him." "But why?" Geoffrey asked, still pale with shock. "Why did he kill Uncle Alistair? You said something about a letter." "Lord Donovan discovered the captain's deception," Poirot explained. "He found Edmund's hidden evidence and confronted the captain, threatening to expose him unless he broke off the engagement. Captain Ashworth could not allow that. His entire identity, his entire future, depended on maintaining the pretense. So he killed your uncle and staged it to look like the curse, hoping to create confusion and fear." "And the poison in the wine?" "A final, desperate measure. If the investigation came too close, he intended to kill everyone who might expose him and disappear in the chaos. Fortunately, we were able to prevent that." Lady Constance spoke at last, her voice surprisingly soft. "And my husband? Did he know about Edmund's death?" Poirot hesitated. "I believe he suspected, but he had no proof, and perhaps he preferred not to look too closely. Your husband was a man who believed in facts and evidence, Lady Constance. Without proof, he could not act. Or he was too cowardly to act." Her voice was bitter. "He let a murderer walk free in his house for 3 years rather than face the truth. We are all of us capable of great self-deception," Poirot said quietly. "It is perhaps the most human of failings." The police arrived at dawn, their vehicles making slow progress through the freshly cleared roads. Captain Ashworth, Jonathan Briggs, was taken into custody, his military bearing finally broken, his carefully constructed identity in ruins, his face a mask of defeat and bitter hatred. As he was led past Poirot, he paused. "How?" he demanded. "How did you know?" "The little things, monsieur. Always the little things." Poirot's voice was not unkind. "When Mademoiselle Violet screamed upon finding the threatening letter, you did not go to her. A man in love would have rushed to comfort his beloved. But you were calculating, watching, assessing. It was a small thing, but it told me everything." "And that was enough?"
That was the beginning. After that, I looked more closely. I noticed that your accent slipped when you were angry. The Cumberland vowels breaking through.
The educated veneer. I observed that you knew details about this house that a first-time visitor should not know. The location of the servants' passages, for instance, which you used to move about unseen. And when Miss Thornton told me her true identity, I understood that Edmund Donovan had hired her because he suspected you specifically. He would not have gone to such lengths unless he had evidence. The captain, Briggs, stared at him for a long moment. "I almost won," he said finally. 3 years of patience, 3 years of playing the devoted fiancé, and I almost won. But you did not win, monsieur, and you never could have won, because evil, in the end, always defeats itself. It grows arrogant, it makes mistakes, and when it does, Hercule Poirot is there. The police car pulled away, carrying the murderer to justice, and Poirot stood at the window of the great hall, watching until it disappeared around the curve of the drive. Miss Thornton, Arabella, as she had asked him to call her, came to stand beside him.
You knew, she said. From the beginning, you knew it was him.
I suspected from the moment I saw his reaction to Mademoiselle Violet's distress. A man truly in love would have sought to comfort her. The captain was calculating his options. Poirot shook his head. The little grey cells, they do not lie. And the scrap of silk? The red fabric in Lord Donovan's hand? Planted by the captain to implicate you. He knew of your investigation. Perhaps not the details, but enough to know you posed a threat. He hoped to divert suspicion long enough to complete his plan. A clever man. Clever, yes, but not clever enough. Poirot adjusted his cuffs with characteristic precision. Evil, in my experience, ultimately defeats itself. It grows overconfident, it makes mistakes, and then it falls. Helena approached them, her face still pale but composed. Monsieur Poirot, I cannot thank you enough. You have saved my daughter's life, and perhaps all our lives. How can I ever repay you? Poirot bowed slightly. Justice is its own reward, madame, but if you insist, a cup of your excellent coffee would not go amiss. She managed a small smile. Of course. And, Monsieur Poirot? Yes? The curse. Was any of it real? Or was it all just a cover for murder? Poirot considered the question carefully. The curse was real in this sense, madame. It was a story told and retold over generations. A legend that shaped the expectations and fears of your family. Captain Ashworth merely used that story to his advantage, knowing that people would believe in supernatural explanations rather than look for human evil. So, the ravens, the voices, the flickering lights, all arranged by the captain, with some assistance from technology he concealed about the house. The raven call was a recording device. The lights were controlled by a switch in his room. As for the actual ravens that circle the house, Poirot smiled slightly. They are merely birds, madame. Attracted by the food scraps the captain scattered to ensure their presence, the natural world is often simpler than we imagine. Helena nodded slowly. And the mistletoe? The ancient mistletoe that hangs in the great hall. Poirot looked up at the dried plant, swaying gently in the morning draught. It is mistletoe, madame, nothing more. But I would suggest that you begin a new tradition, one based on love and family, not fear and superstition.
Let the curse die with Captain Ashworth's crimes. I think, Helena said softly, that is excellent advice.
Christmas morning dawned bright and clear, the snow sparkling in the winter sunlight like scattered diamonds. The roads were open, the police had completed their initial investigation, and the shadow that had hung over Ravenmere Hall seemed finally to have lifted. Poirot took his breakfast in the dining room, where the family had gathered in various states of recovery. Violet sat beside her mother, pale but calm, her hands steady for the first time in days. Geoffrey and Lady Constance conversed quietly at the far end of the table, and Dr. Webb was holding forth on the proper treatment for shock to anyone who would listen. Only Miss Thornton, Arabella, seemed unchanged by the night's events. She ate her eggs with evident appetite and conversed with Poirot about the finer points of private investigation, as if murder and mayhem were merely professional hazards. "I shall be returning to London this afternoon," Poirot announced, setting down his coffee cup. "My work here is finished." "Must you go so soon?" Helena asked. "We had hoped you might stay for Christmas dinner, at least."
Poirot smiled. "You are most kind, madame, but I find I am eager to return to my own surroundings. The countryside, it is beautiful, but Hercule Poirot is a creature of the city. The noise, the movement, the life, these are what sustain me." "Then we must thank you again, and wish you a safe journey." Helena rose and extended her hand. "You have given us the greatest Christmas gift of all, Monsieur Poirot. The gift of truth." "Truth," Poirot said thoughtfully, taking her hand, "is often a painful gift, madame, but it is also a necessary one. Without truth, there can be no justice, and without justice, there can be no peace." He took his leave of the family, one by one. Violet, who thanked him with tears in her eyes. Geoffrey, who shook his hand with awkward gratitude. Lady Constance, who merely nodded, but whose eyes held something like respect. And Dr. Webb, who pressed upon him a card with instructions to visit should he ever need medical attention. Arabella walked him to the waiting car. "I suppose this is goodbye," she said. "For now, perhaps." Poirot adjusted his hat with care. "But I have a feeling, Miss Thornton, that our paths will cross again. You have the makings of a fine investigator. With more experience, you might become formidable." She smiled. "High praise from Hercule Poirot." "I do not give praise lightly." He climbed into the car and rolled down the window. "One piece of advice, if I may." "Of course." "Trust your instincts. They are good ones. But also, trust the little grey cells." He tapped his temple. "They will never lead you astray." The car pulled away, crunching over the snow-covered drive, and Poirot settled back against the leather seat with a sigh of contentment. The case was solved. Justice had been served, and Christmas, despite everything, had arrived. As the car rounded the final bend, Poirot turned for one last look at Ravenmere Hall. The great house stood silhouetted against the winter sky, its dark stones somehow less forbidding in the morning light. Smoke curled from a dozen chimneys. Windows that had seemed like dead eyes now caught the sunrise and sparkled with warm gold. The raven weather vane atop the highest tower gleamed like polished brass. And was it his imagination, or did he see a single black bird take flight from the tower, rising higher and higher until it vanished into the bright Christmas sky?
Joyeux Noël, Ravenmere, Poirot murmured. And goodbye. He thought of the Donovans as the car wound down the mountain road, what remained of them and what they might become. Helena, freed at last from the shadow of her husband's murder, could finally grieve honestly, and then move forward. Violet, whose heart had been broken, but whose life had been saved, was young enough to heal, to trust again, to find genuine love. Lady Constance, widowed, but perhaps not as devastated as a widow should be, would maintain the family dignity with iron will. Geoffrey, uncertain and sensitive, would now inherit the estate his father had schemed for, and perhaps he would prove worthy of it. Perhaps, with Miss Thornton's friendship and guidance, he might grow into something better than his father had been. And Arabella Thornton herself, what of her? She had spent 3 years pursuing justice for a dead man. She had succeeded, but Poirot suspected that success felt hollow to her, as it often did when justice came too late to save those who needed saving. Still, she had acquitted herself well. Very well indeed. Perhaps their paths would cross again someday. The case was closed. The mystery was solved. But the echoes would continue. In the lives changed, the secrets revealed, the bonds broken, and the bonds formed. Such was the nature of murder. It was never just about the dead. It was always, ultimately, about the living, those left behind to carry the weight of what had been done. The train journey south was peaceful, the countryside sliding past in a blur of white and grey. Poirot dozed in his first-class compartment, his mind finally at rest, the satisfactions of a case well solved warming him like good brandy. He thought of the Donovans, what remained of them, and wondered what their future would hold. Helena and Violet, freed at last from the shadow of murder. Lady Constance, widowed but perhaps relieved. Geoffrey, who would now inherit everything his father had schemed for, though whether he deserved it or wanted it remained to be seen. And Arabella Thornton, the mysterious woman who had finally achieved her goal after 3 years of patient waiting. She had justice for her client now, even if that client was beyond caring. Such was the nature of their profession, solving puzzles for the dead, bringing peace to the living. London welcomed Poirot home with grey skies and damp streets, but he had never been so glad to see it. His apartment at Whitehaven Mansions was warm and orderly, exactly as he had left it. George had preceded him by an earlier train and had everything prepared. A fire in the grate, fresh flowers on the table, his favourite tisane steaming in its cup. "I trust your journey was satisfactory, sir?" George inquired, taking Poirot's coat. "It was most satisfactory, George. Most satisfactory indeed." Poirot settled into his armchair with a sigh of pleasure. "Though, I confess, I am glad to be home. The country, it is good for the health, perhaps, but for the spirit, bah, give me London every time." "Yes, sir. And the case? Was it successfully concluded?" "It was, George. A murderer unmasked, a family freed from fear, and justice served in time for Christmas. What more could one ask?" George permitted himself a small smile. "Very good, sir. Will there be anything else?" "No, George, thank you.
I shall simply sit here by the fire and contemplate the curious nature of human wickedness.
Poirot took a sip of his tisane.
And perhaps, later, a small glass of cognac. It is Christmas, after all. Very good, sir.
As George withdrew, Poirot gazed into the dancing flames and allowed his thoughts to wander. The Christmas mistletoe mystery, as he had come to call it in his mind, had been a fascinating case, rich in historical detail, complex in its layers of deception, and satisfying in its ultimate resolution. But beneath the satisfaction, there was always the faint melancholy that accompanied the exposure of evil. Captain Ashworth had been a murderer, yes, a cold-blooded killer who had taken 2 lives and planned to take more. But he had also been a man driven by circumstances, shaped by poverty and exclusion into something twisted and dark. It was not excuse. It was never excuse. But it was, perhaps, explanation. And understanding the why of crime was, for Poirot, almost as important as proving the who. The fire crackled. The clock ticked. Outside, the bells of London began to ring, announcing Christmas to the world. Hercule Poirot raised his cup in a silent toast. To justice, to truth, and to all those who sought them in a world too often shrouded in darkness.
Joyeux Noël,
he murmured to no one in particular.
and may the new year bring light.
The case was closed. The mystery was solved. And in his comfortable apartment, surrounded by order and warmth, the great detective allowed himself a rare moment of perfect contentment. Until, of course, the next mystery should call.